All right, so a couple of quick observations about quizzes before we start. Just a reminder, if you don't score an 8 or better on the quiz, please turn in the notes. It will move your score up to an 8. I have too many quizzes below 8 that don't turn in notes. I understand. You should use the notes before the quiz. I said, so you should look at what's going to be on the quiz and make sure those notes kind of line up with what you took, hopefully, from the discussion and what you've taken from the book and the slides yourself. Remember, I can't cover everything needed in 2 hours. I have 2 hours a week to try to cover things. I can put out only so many slides and only so much out of the textbook. It's a balancing act between what I put out to make a class streamlined and what overwhelms students. So I have to try to find this right balance. I know for some of you it won't be enough. As I said, I have to make hard choices. You are always more than welcome to go out and try to find YouTube videos. Okay? Sometimes they explain it sometimes in a different way than I do, and it works for you. Again, I'm limited on how many different ways I can explain something, and some people will do some things better than me. That will be their comparative advantage. And so if you don't get something, please feel free. If you see something on YouTube and you don't know whether it's right or not, you're more than welcome to send me the link and I'll watch it and I'll tell you if it's good or bad. I said I have no problem doing that. So please make sure you are trying to learn the material. Part of an online class is you got to ask questions. Send me emails. I usually pretty quick back on my emails. So please send me an email if you have questions. Sorry, I'm a little behind on quiz 11B notes. I thought I did them on Saturday, but I looked today and I did not. I apologize for that. Sometimes I forget to do them on the weekend and I apologize. I'm usually not that bad, but I messed up this time and I will get them done this afternoon. All right, so today we're going to cover Chapter 13. Chapter 13 deals with the financial system. So in 2008, the last time the U.S. had a recession, what happened was we had a failure of the financial system. A lot of students, a lot of people struggle to understand what we mean by the financial system. What is the financial system? Well, it doesn't actually produce any goods. All the financial system does is it's a group of institutions that help match savings and investment. So what we're going to talk about this chapter is we're going to talk about financial systems and specifically the financial institutions in those systems. We're going to talk about the benefit to the economy, why we have them, how we save money, what's the difference between savings and investment, how does the financial system coordinate all of this, and how does the government impact these decisions. So we're going to spend a lot of time talking about this financial system. It's a relatively important system. And what it does at the very, very basics is it helps match a savings to an investment. So a lot of times, I'm going to point this out throughout this talk today, but a lot of times students confuse the term investment. So in this class, investment does not mean stocks and bonds. If you invest, that does not mean you are buying stocks and bonds. Now, the minute you get off this discussion and you go outside of here, that's what people use to talk about buying stocks and bonds. I try to make sure I use the correct term. The correct term of buying stocks and bonds is saving. As an individual, as a person, I save. Businesses invest. So think about that as we talk about this. Savings is done by individuals. Businesses are the ones that invest. So that's kind of how we need to focus on this. Savings is done by me. Investment is what is done by businesses. So there are two types of financial institutions that allow these transactions to occur. They're called financial markets and financial intermediaries. And their job or their role in the economy is to match savers to borrowers. Because what they want to do is they want to take idle resources. Since my resources are doing nothing as I'm a saver, I've saved up resources. Is I'm doing nothing with these resources. So what we call them idle. What the bank does is say, Dr. Walsh said, you weren't doing anything with these resources. Give them to us. And what we will do is we will give them to somebody else. And we'll hold them. So that way, when you want them back, you can get them back. So what we do as savers is I give my idle resources to somebody else. And when I give my resources to somebody else, what they're going to do is they're going to give me a cut of their resources back. Usually my resources plus a little more. That's called the return. So let's focus on the first one is financial markets. There are two major financial markets where we can interact with borrowers. So a financial market, the term we want to focus on is directly. So as a saver, I get to decide who gets my savings. I get to choose which borrower gets my savings. And we can do this through two instruments. One instrument is called the bond market, and that's a bond. The second one is a stock market, and that instrument is referred to as a stock. So what is a bond? A bond, by definition, is a certificate of indebtedness. It's an IOU. It's a loan. So when I decide I want to save money, I decide which company gets my money. So I give my $1,000 to, let's just say, GM. So if I give my $1,000 to GM, GM gets my money. And what they're going to do if I have a bond is they're going to pay me my money back, my $1,000. And they're going to pay me over 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, 30 years. And they're going to give me an interest rate. So when I loan my money to GM through the bond, they promise to give me $1,000 back, and they're going to pay me 3% interest rate for 2 years. So they're going to tell me in 2 years I'm going to get back $1,060. So for letting GM use my resources, they're going to give me 60 extra. So I'm going to receive more resources than I gave GM. With a bond market, my payment is set. It's going to be based on how long we loan it out, what interest rate, and what I gave them. So a bond is a very stable, not very risky investment because we know kind of the idea of what will happen. Now, a stock is entirely more risky. What a stock does is it gets me ownership in the firm. And as an owner, I have a claim to profits. So depending on how much I own, depends on how much of the profits I can claim. The greater the ownership, the more profits I can claim. So if a company, so if I buy $1,000 in a stock and the company becomes very, very profitable, well, I might make back $5,000 or $6,000. However, if I give $1,000 to a stock and it becomes not profitable, I might actually lose my money. So with stocks, we have a chance to get a really high return, and we also have a chance to get a really low return. With a bond, it's pretty stable. So sometimes they refer to a stock as riskier. So if I take a riskier investment, I have the opportunity to earn higher returns. I don't have a lot of time today, but please go through the book, and there's lots of discussion in terms about stocks and bonds. So there's a lot of kind of vocab about that. So please read the book about the vocab. It talks about terms, rate of interest, default, and all of that. I just wanted to give you kind of this quick, broad outline of what the two financial markets are. The second thing of how we use financial institutions is through financial intermediaries. And the difference between them is, as an intermediary, there is an indirect match. Or as a saver, I don't get to decide who gets my funds. I give it to a third party. And the third party decides who gets my funds. So if I go to First National Bank and I give them my savings, I can't go and say, please don't give that money to Amber. I don't like Amber. I don't want her to borrow my money. I can't do that. Well, I can. They're just going to laugh at me and say, Dr. Walsh, I don't care. Once you give them your money, you don't have control. They get to decide who matches with you. So that's what happens when you give your savings to a bank, is they decide who gets your savings. So I don't have control of that. Same thing works with a mutual fund. So what happens with a mutual fund is I say, hey, I want to save into the stock market, but I don't want to do it directly. What I do is I go to a mutual fund and say, here's my savings. You go and you decide which firms get my savings. So you go and decide which stocks and bonds to buy, because I'm not very good at it. I'm going to give you, a mutual fund, the power to do that for me. So let's go over them kind of quickly again. Banks, primary role of banks, take deposits. They hardly give me any interest. And they use my deposits to make loans to borrowers, and they charge them a higher interest rate. Hence how a bank gets paid. So a bank gets paid what they call on the interest rate margin. Okay, or if this was in retail, what's the markup? Most of the time, banks have a pretty good markup. Usually they mark up somewhere between 3 and 4%, at least for home mortgages. Again, it also depends on what kind of loan you're getting. The more risky the loan, the higher the interest rate you pay. Now, mutual funds are the one I'm going to spend a little bit of time on, because you probably have less experience with this as students. So let's kind of talk about a mutual fund, kind of a quick 2 or 3 minute discussion of what they are. A mutual funds, what they do is they sell shares to the public. So they take my savings through shares. And what they do with my savings is they go and they buy stocks and bonds. But they buy a portfolio of stocks and bonds. So what is the benefit of buying a portfolio? Is it allows me to diversify. Because remember, before we were talking about some stocks are going to go to 6,000 and some stocks are going to go to 0. So on average, that's a $3,000 return. Now, if I were to pick one stock only, well, I might pick the 0 or I might pick the 6. However, if I buy them both, I get a better chance of having a $3,000 return. I mean, I won't get the 6, but I also won't get the 0. But that's a whole lot better than saving my money before, because I could only get like $60 if I saved it in a bond. Here, I'd get $2,000. So one of the advantages of mutual funds is I pay someone, and what he does with my small amount of money is he allows me to diversify it, because they pull lots of people's money together, and they're able to buy more and more companies to diversify my holdings. Because if I diversify, it's a little less risky, but I get a better return, a better average return than if I just did it myself. The second advantage And this is one that economists aren't so buying. Is that if I give ordinary people the access to professional money managers. So what a mutual fund does is I give my money to an individual. We'll just call him Ethan. So if I give my money to Ethan, who's a professional, right? Ethan went to Harvard. Right, he's got an MBA. He's worked in the financial institution. Maybe I can write that. My pen. So he works in financial institution for years. He's been there 10 plus years. All right, he's got great returns. Okay, Ethan has it all. However, the problem with Ethan is Ethan costs money. In order for me to have access to him, Ethan's not going to work for free. Ethan wants to be paid. And so what we have here with this mutual fund managers, even though I get access to Ethan, but Ethan is expensive. So what economists have found is that there's another individual you can use in the market. Okay. Here's my individual. My individual is named Larry. Maybe he'll get there. And here's what's special about Larry. Larry is kind of a unique individual. Because Larry, here's his characteristics. Larry is brown and hairy. What? Oh, and Larry likes to be paid in bananas. So yes, Larry is a monkey. So why would I put my money with a monkey? Well, all I taught my monkey to do is to buy the S&P 500 and sell the S&P 500. My monkey doesn't have to think because there's a list that tells him which 500 companies to buy. And when I want my money out, he just sells those companies to give me my share back. So my monkey doesn't have to think. Therefore, I don't have to pay him a lot. This is referred to as index investing. Is all I am doing is putting my savings into a certain index fund. And all this fund does is buy the S&P 500 or sell the S&P 500. And since it's a very simple process, it doesn't involve any real intelligence because the S&P, Standard & Poor, puts the list out for me. I don't even have to think of the list. They do it for me. They say, here's the list, Dr. Walscheid. So I go, okay, I tell my monkey, go buy my list. And he does. And since I don't have to pay him very much, who wins? Right? The question is which strategy will win over the long term? Ethan or Larry? Well, there's a very famous individual. And his name is Warren Buffett. If you know much about Warren Buffett, he's kind of rich. In fact, I think he's fourth or fifth wealthiest man in the world. So he's way up there. And what Warren did is he said, I'll make a bet. I'll make a $1 million bet to anybody who wants to pick me up on it. He goes, and here's what the bet is. After 10 years, we're going to have a contest. So he goes, 10 years. So after 10 years, I get to pick one of these two individuals. I get to pick first because I'm putting up the money. So Warren goes, I'll pick first. Warren goes, I'm going to take Larry. So from 10 years from now, I'm going to see how well Larry does. Warren says, you can pick any of the Ethans you want in the world. Go for it. So he made this bet to the financial community. It took the financial community over a year before they would take him up on it. And finally, one of the Ethans took him up on it and said, all right, Warren, I'll try to take your money. And I can't remember the exact numbers, but I'll help you out. Warren won by about 50%. So Warren says, all that access to hedge fund money doesn't make much of a difference. I can beat it with Larry. And on average, Larry's going to win. So what does that tell me as an econ student? Why do I care? Well, because it gives me the biggest idea for what to do with my retirement. Because what happens is most of you will leave this university, get a job, and have a 401k. And what they will do with that 401k is they'll say, congratulations, you got a 401k. Now, where do you want to save your money? And you're going to go, I don't know. Where do I want to save my money? So right now, I'm going to tell you where you want to save your money. You want to go when you want to look for the mutual fund in your options that tracks the S&P 500 that has the lowest cost. And then put your money there. So you go look at your 401k, say, oh, there it is, Vanguard. There it is, the Vanguard market that tracks the S&P 500. It doesn't cost me anything. I'm going to put all my money there. I'm going to turn it back into HR and walk away. And after 30 years, you'll be very happy you made that decision. You may not be the richest person at the party, but you will have a very nice life. I think that's what most of us are shooting for, just a nice life. And then in 30 years, you'll have more money than you'll believe. And then you can hire an Ethan to figure out what to do with your money, because that's when Ethan's good. Ethan's good when you have lots of money and you want to try to save it from the government and taxes. That's when Ethan comes in. Ethan's not very good at getting your savings, your stocks and bonds. What you pay Ethan for is so you don't have to pay the money to the government. That's what Ethan does well. So Ethan will help you plan around taxes to follow all those laws, but you want to hire Larry to do your savings when you're young, because all you have to do is tell him to put in the S&P 500 and go away. And that will help out you the best retirement advice I can give you. Just put it there, go away, never have to pay attention to it again. Never have to worry about it. Now, why? Yes, they each have their own little differences. Usually a 401k is a company, and usually they'll match it. So I would always do a 401k if my company was going to match it. So here at the university, we do match contributions. The monkey is just an individual. So Francisco, the monkey is just, it could be a computer. It's just something that works without any thinking. So that's what I mean by a monkey. It's a figurative. Yes, it is figurative. It's just something that doesn't have to think. Right? It just pushes a button and I give it a banana and say, woo, congratulations. And it pushes the other button to sell. It's a very simple process. And why each of them have their own kind of tax advantages. We don't really have much time to get into that, but I would save in as much as you can. Savings is how you become wealthy. So save as much as you can. If you get a 401k at work, you should always be saving up to the match. And in fact, most financial advisors, what they tell you to do for savings is think about it for a little bit. You'll write down a number. So you come to your degree and you go, when you get out of college, what you should write down on your 401k, I'm going to tell you right now, is you should write down 10%. Because you won't notice the money being gone. If you never have the money, you'll never miss it. The problem is if you write down, oh, I'm going to increase later, you won't. Whatever number you write down as a 25-year-old when you first take your job is almost always the number you keep when you're 55. And what I tell you is why you won't notice at 25 is you're used to being poor. And if you put the money away, you'll never miss it. However, once you start with the money, you'll never want to give it back. So put it when you're young. You'll never miss it. I'll help you out there. Nobody who's put down 10% ever feels bad about it 10 years later. People who put down 2% feel bad about it 10 years later. I said, there's been study after study done with finances, and they said, whatever number you write down, in fact, on your way over to the HR office, add one. That's when people used to walk it over. They said, write down a number at your desk, and when you walk over to the HR office, just go ahead and add one. No one will miss it. You won't miss 1% of your income, but it can turn into quite a bit over time, right? Because we talked about how money grows at an exponential rate. So the ability of money saved, especially when you're young, grows exponentially. Hopefully you got that in personal finance. If not, pay attention. That's one of the best lessons I can teach in personal finance, how to save and become wealthy. They don't necessarily do a very good job of it. But the more money you can save when you're young, the better off you'll be when you're older. Just kind of how it works. So the first part of the chapter is kind of the micro parts. So that's kind of how some of these very basic institutions work. I don't like this. I like to spend a whole lot more time on it than I can. I said I love to talk about savings that individuals can do to become wealthy, but I just don't have enough time in it. I wish we could, but in theory, that's why we have a personal finance class at this university. They can spend a whole lot more time into that, or at least that's the goal. I get 30 minutes out of this semester to do that, and it's sad, but that's the best I can. You're always free to come by my office and ask questions about things like 401ks, Roth IRAs, and I'll give you my best advice. Again, it's not professional, but it's what I call kind of a friendly advice. Is kind of, I'll tell you what economic research says are good ways to save your money. And you're more than welcome to come by and talk with me about that anytime. I have students come by and chat about that all the time. I'll talk about the stock market, the bond market, whatever you want to talk about, you're more than welcome to stop by my office and discuss that. But we got to move on to the macro part of this savings. So we go back to the original equation we had for GDP. Y equals C plus I plus G plus NX. So we have consumption, investment, government purchases, net exports. So what we're going to do to start with is we're going to make life easy. Is we're going to do something called a closed economy. Well, what's a closed economy mean? That means we shut ourselves off from the rest of the world. So what we do is we just X off NX. So we just set NX equal to 0. So that means as a country, we don't export and we don't import. And why we do this is to make life easy. So the goal is to make our lives easier. We will open the world back up and open the economy back up in chapters 18 and 19. And life gets a whole lot harder and you'll curse me then. But right now we're going to make life simple. So we have a simple now equation, y equals C plus I plus G. We can rewrite our equation to put investment on one side and this gobbledygook on the other side. Right, very simple. I just subtract C, subtract G. I get Y minus C minus G equals I. And what we find in economics is the savings of a country equals its investment. So here's the investment part. So therefore, that has to be savings. So by definition, Y minus C minus G is what we call savings. Sometimes we add an adjective to it and we call it national savings. So we talk about how much savings is in a country, we call that the national savings. And if we want to find the rate, all we would do is divide by Y, and that's the savings rate. But how much national savings we have is simply GDP minus consumption minus government spending. That tells us how much national savings we have. And the national savings of a country has to equal its investment if the economy doesn't interact with the rest of the world. So it's a closed economy. So what we're also going to do now is we're going to break down savings to what is done by households, called private savings, and what is done by governments, called public savings. It's kind of important to us to talk about savings. We should talk about savings from multiple perspectives. So from the macro level, we're going to talk about what do households do in savings and what do governments do. And so how much money do I as an individual save? Well, that depends on how much money I make, how much the government takes in my taxes, and how much I decide to spend on my own. That's what we get with private savings. With public savings, well, the government has to get income. The only way the government gets income is through taxation. And we subtract away how much they spend. So if the government spends more than it brings in on taxes, we refer to that situation as a deficit, as a budget deficit. If taxes are greater than government spending, we refer to that situation as a surplus. So each government entity can either have a deficit or a surplus. Or if they're equal, that would be called a balanced budget. So the national savings is always equal to private plus public. Now, what students often ask me is, Dr. Wilshide, you told us national savings was Y minus C minus G. What happened to T? Well, when you write out the equation, Y minus T minus C is private, plus T minus G is public. What you should notice is that the T's cancel out. Because the T's cancel out, therefore, at national savings, it is only Y minus C minus G. Because the T's cancel negative and positive. Talked about already what a budget surplus is, what a budget deficit is. So let's do a quick example here. All right, we still have a little bit of time. So I give you the following information. GDP, 19 trillion. Consumption, 13 trillion. Government purchases, 2.5 trillion. A budget deficit of 1.2 trillion. So this could very easily be a quiz question. And what I would ask, well, what I could ask is, what is public savings? What is net taxes? What is private savings? What's national savings? What's investment? So I could ask any one of those 5 things. So I'm going to give you a little bit of time. Try to see if you can't quickly come up with what is public savings. That's easy. That's negative 0.12 trillion. I already told you what that one was. So we're running a deficit. So G is greater than T. So because I know that, therefore taxes, right, it's supposed to be T minus 2.5 trillion equals negative 1.2 trillion. Add 2.5 trillion to each side. And T equals 1.3 trillion. So I know what T is, so now I can find private savings equals Y minus T minus C. So that's 19 minus 13 minus 1.3. So that's 6 minus 1.3, 4.7. I get national savings. It's 4.7 plus a negative 1.2. National savings is 3.5 trillion. Since national savings is 3.5 trillion, investment is also 3.5 trillion. So please make sure you work those problems, especially the ones I give you kind of in these active learning. Don't look at the answers. If you're struggling, go through and see if you can't solve it. So let's kind of quickly go through a couple of definitions here. What do I mean by private savings? I kind of already hinted at it. It's what households save. That's us buying bonds, putting our money in a bank, buying shares of mutual funds, buying stocks, just putting it in, just letting it sit in my savings and checking account. That is all what we refer to as savings in the U.S. economy. That is how individuals save. That is how we save money. We can do it through multiple entities. You could do it through retirement accounts, your regular checking accounts. How, buried in your backyard, it does not matter. That is how we save money. If I save money outside of the financial institution, it doesn't do much good, but it's possible for me to save money that way as well. The second thing is investment. Investment is businesses buying new capital. So for example, General Motors buys a new factory. I buy new equipment for my home business. My parents buy a new house for $300,000. Those would be examples of investment. I wrote it up here. I wrote up here in red 3 times. I promise you, you'll be asked that question almost always. And somebody will put investment as the purchase of stocks and bonds. In economics, it is not, it is not, it is not. When we talk about buying stocks and bonds, that is savings as an investment. Sorry, that is savings to an economist. That is not investment. Now, the problem is when you talk to finance people, they do call it investments, and I can't stop them no matter how hard I try. I said, really, you want to talk about savings? But they like the term investment. It sounds sexier, I'll be honest. I said, savings sounds boring, and it is. It's a boring activity. However, it's how you become wealthy over time. If I can leave my savings alone and don't touch it, it grows to be a very, 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 very big pot. You'll often see stories. It's kind of strange, but you'll see stories. Usually it's of little old ladies who have saved their money into their retirement account, usually at some company like GE. And every year they put 10% of their savings into GE over 30, 40 years. And they'll talk about when they died, they had tens of millions of dollars. Because what they did is they just saved their money and they became extraordinarily wealthy. And when we talk about these little old ladies, they weren't CEOs, they weren't executives. Usually they were administrative assistants. But all they did was save their money. And the ability to save their money over time allowed them to become wealthy. And in reality, if students ask me, how do I become wealthy, Dr. Walsh? I want to become rich. Okay? The easiest way, well, it may not be the easiest, but the safest way for you to become rich is just to save your money. You can go and work for any company you want, just put away your savings, and you're able to grow wealth. And you'll be amazed at how much you will have when you retire and putting away savings. It's hard. I'm not saying it's easy. I said it won't be easy for you to just go, hey, I want to save 10%. 15% is really where you should try to shoot for. I want to save 15% of my income when I start my first job. I want to save 15% of my income now. And you'll be shocked at how rich you will become by saving 15% of your income. You won't believe me. But you'll be rich enough that you could give plenty of university back, plenty of money to the university, and still have a lot yourself. But it's hard to write down that 15%. It's hard to say I'm going to give 15% to my savings. But as I always tell students, you'll be happy you did that. So what we're going to talk about then is how do savings and investments interact? And we're going to get back to a supply and demand model. So we're going to start to see now supply and demand through the rest of the semester. Is we're going to talk about how these models work. But we're going to talk about what we call the loanable funds. So how do we get funds to the bank? What's the product? The product is loanable funds. And so we're going to talk about how this financial system allocates savings and investment, or how it allocates loanable funds. So we're going to assume, for simplicity, there's only one financial institution, only one financial market. So all the savings has to go into this little area, and all the borrowers take from this market. Why we do this is to make life easier. So what we end up with is one price, the interest rate. And at this interest rate is both the return to savers and the cost of borrowing. Now, we're taking out a lot of the middlemen just to make life easier. Okay, if we make it more complex, our results and our ending doesn't change. It's just the numbers we use to get there become extremely difficult. So we're going to make it very simple. We're going to make life simple. The savings rate is the same as the borrowing rate. I know when you give the bank, what you give the bank and what you receive in a savings deposit isn't the same that you get if you borrowed it. But we're going to assume for this class it is, just to make life easier. So the supply for loanable funds is simply savings. So where do I get those loanable funds from? It's how much individuals and governments save. So it's both private and public savings. So supply is what it always is, upward sloping. So if the interest rate was 3%, there would be $60 billion in savings. If the interest rate goes up, just like prices go up, we go up to $80 billion in savings. Just like always, price changes, we move along the line. So if the interest rate changes, we just move along our supply line. Demand for loanable funds is what businesses use for investment. And just like before, demand, you can just write investment over here, is downward sloping. So if the interest rate is high, I won't borrow as much money. As the interest rates fall, I'm more likely to borrow more money. So as the interest rates fall, the businesses go, oh, it's cheaper for me to build a factory. So what they do is they go out and they borrow money to build a factory. So as the interest rates fall, we have a greater quantity demanded for investment, just like always. So prices fall, we move along the line. So just like we did in chapter 4, supply, except here we want to think about supply as being savings, demand as being investment. We talked about before, savings equals investment. So that's what the interest rate does. It gives us a point where quantity supplied equals quantity demanded, where the amount of savings in a country equals the amount of investment. So all we did is we took the graph from chapter 4, fancied it up a little bit, changed the price and called it interest rates. The quantity is now loanable funds. Supply is just an acronym for savings. And demand is for investment. So what we're going to do is, I'm kind of short on time, but we're going to go through it kind of quickly. Please read the book and go through more examples of how to do the following 3. What happens to change private savings, investment, and public savings? How does the government encourage or discourage the following things? So we'll start with private savings. So how do I encourage people to save more money? Wyatt wrote 2 of them right there. The Roth IRA and the 401k, is those both give tax advantages for people to save more money. And if I give a tax advantage, is I haven't changed the interest rates, but what happens is I encourage people to save more money, and they do. So if I get a tax incentive, such as a 401k, right? That's why 401ks were created. Roth IRAs were created as well, is to give tax advantages for people to save money. And when I give them a tax advantage, well, what happens is they're able to save more of their money with less taxes, so they do. And that causes supply to shift right. And when supply shifts right, interest rates fall, quantity rises, just like before. So just like before, right? If we go back to chapter 4, as I increase savings, prices fall, quantity rises. So just like before, I increase supply, prices fall. Here it's the interest rates. And quantity rises. So I get more savings and I get more investment. Right? So if I encourage people to save, we get more investment overall as a country. So there's lots of different mechanisms that the government can do to encourage me to save. How they tax. So it used to be popular to talk about a consumption or a sales tax versus an income tax. If we were to switch to a consumption tax, it would encourage people to save money. Because if I only get taxed on what I spend, then I'm less likely to spend money and more likely to save it. So different ways of how do they affect individuals' behaviors or ideas, beliefs about savings. Do I encourage more savings or do I discourage it? Do I take away the ability to go to a 401k? Do I take away the ability to use a Roth IRA? How does that change savings behavior? So policy 1 deals with private savings behavior, how that changes. Policy 2 deals with investment incentives. How do I encourage more demand for loanable funds? Or how do I encourage businesses to invest more? Well, one of the ways we can do it is through lower taxes. They call it a tax credit, but just what it really is if I lower businesses' taxes, what I'm hoping they'll do is they'll increase their investments. And when they do, interest rates rise, but I get more investment. You saw this probably 2 years ago. Amazon was going around saying, all right, which city wants us? We're going to invest a lot of money. Who wants to have us invest the money in your city? And what tax incentives are you going to give us to invest in your city, build new capital in your city? So Amazon was shopping around for the lowest tax rate. I think they ended up in they ended up in New York City, but they got kicked out of there. They took away their tax credits. I think they ended up in DC, but I don't remember where they ended up with. And then finally, the third one, this is going to be public savings. So if I have a deficit, if my deficit gets bigger, or if I get a surplus, that's going to change the behavior. So let's start with kind of a quick example here. I have just a little bit of time, so I'm going to rush it a little bit here. I apologize. So we start with a balanced budget. I know that's kind of a far-fetched belief, but we can start anywhere. And what happens if we decide to run a budget deficit? How is that going to affect our economy? So here's where we start with. If we're going to run a budget deficit, that means savings will decrease. And savings decrease not because the interest rate changed, but because the government decided it wanted to spend more or tax less. So what happens is savings supply shifts left. When supply shifts left, the interest rate rises. And what we get is loanable funds or investment decreases. So a budget deficit gives us higher interest rates and lower investment. A lot of times what economists refer to this situation is as crowding out. So what happens is the government borrows money for whatever it is the government wants to spend money on. Well, it's taking the loanable funds available from businesses because it's pushing the interest rates up. And when it does that, we get less private investment. Economists often ask is which is better, private investment or government investment? Most of the time the answer to that is private investment. Why? Because governments have perverse incentives. A company's job, we talked about, is to serve the community. Because they don't serve the community right, they're going to be out of business. The government's ability is to keep their job. Well, does that mean best serving the community? Not necessarily. Those two things aren't synonymous. They should be, but they're not. A government official is going to try to spend money on what's going to help his or her reelection to keep their job. They aren't going to spend money on necessarily what's best for society. They have different motives. And if they're wrong, who cares? Nobody votes them out of office. They made me happy. They bought a new water park in my city. I'm not disappointed with them. If I was disappointed with them, I always probably was disappointed with them. But what they try to do is they try to spend it so they want to be reelected. So they may not build what they think is best, but they'll build on what they think can be to have him or her reelected. So what has happened to the U.S. debt over time? If you go back to the 1800s, we almost had no debt. Right before World War I, we were almost at zero debt. And then, boom, look what happens. World War I, debt goes up a little bit. But it goes back down really quickly. We get to World War II. Again, debt will always increase during wars because you have less production going on and you're going to need lots of war equipment. So it is not uncommon to see this, as well as the quick fall after we stop spending so much money on the military. However, from about the 70s onward, we've seen a steady trek upward. And in fact, we're now all the way almost up here, back up to where we were around World War II. But we aren't in a world war right now. I know we do have some conflicts across the world. But what the problem is debt to GDP has risen significantly in the past couple of years. And the higher it rises, the more it becomes a problem. Debt in itself isn't a problem. Some of you are probably borrowing money right now. That's not a problem. The problem is when you start to borrow too much money that you can't pay it back. That's when debt becomes a problem. So I have some slides here that go through it in a nutshell. We don't have much time, so I'm not going to go over them, but please feel free to read them. You'll need to read through them and see them and talk about them. All right, I know it was a little quick today, and I apologize because I'm a little bit late, but are there any questions before